Good afternoon. Welcome to City Club of Portland Friday Forum. I'm John Horvick, the president of City Club, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you joining us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. We're going to be live broadcasting today's forum with U.S. Attorney Amanda Marshall on OPB's Think Out Loud, moderated by David Miller. But first, I'm going to have some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum corporate sponsors, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Join us next week for our last program of the season at our regular time. Our panelists will discuss Oregon's wine country, how Oregon's wine country is becoming an international wine and culinary destination. And remember, we will not hold any Friday forums in August, so you can enjoy the rest of your summer, and we'll see you after Labor Day. You can learn more about club events and purchase tickets and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. And as always, we'll be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag Marshall on TOL. Think Out Loud will take a 90-second break about 20 minutes into our program today, and at that point, City Club members are welcome to come to the microphone to ask their questions. We'll take a few questions from City Club members during the broadcast. We've also set aside 20 minutes after for more questions. All audience participants can locate the index card on the center of their tables as well and write your questions on them during the broadcast. Please raise your hand after the broadcast is over, and City Club staff will collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. Thanks again for joining us today. The program will begin shortly. Dave Miller and Amanda Marshall will be up here and sort of circle the wagons. And enjoy your lunch, and we'll begin in just a few minutes.
Hello, I'm Dave Miller. It's Think Out Loud live from the Governor Hotel in front of an audience from the City Club of Portland. We're spending the hour today with Amanda Marshall. As the U.S. Attorney for the District of Oregon, she is the top federal prosecutor in the state and the Justice Department's point person here. Amanda Marshall has been on the job for about 2 years. In that time, she's dealt with the use of force by Portland police, child trafficking, anti-terrorism efforts, marijuana laws, and much more. We're going to talk about all of this today. We're also going to find out how a self-described rebellious and challenging child ended up as a prosecutor. You're welcome in this conversation. We're going to take some questions from our audience here at the Governor Hotel. As always, our radio audience can join in on the phone. The number is 1-888-665-5865. Our website, opb.org/thinkoutloud. Amanda Marshall, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, Dave. Thank you.
Let's start with the Department of Justice's settlement with the City of Portland over the use of force, excessive use of force by the Portland Police Bureau. There is some news just yesterday and today about this. As a reminder to everybody, the settlement came after a 15-month-long investigation by the DOJ found a pattern or a practice of excessive use of force by the Portland Police Bureau, especially against people with mental illness. This past November, the City Council agreed to make changes on use of force, on tasers, on training, on discipline, and some other things. At that point, when the City Council said, yes, we'll make these changes, what did you think was going to happen?
What did I think was going to happen? Well, what I thought was going to happen is exactly what happened next, which was that the government, the United States, filed a consent decree and simultaneously filed the settlement agreement that we had reached with the City of Portland. So what we thought would happen was that the court would enter the settlement agreement and Portland Police would begin to implement the reforms that had already been identified and then continue the process of identifying additional reforms which are set out through the collaborative agreement. What did in fact happen was that the Portland Police Union and the Albina Ministerial Association both filed to become involved in the case and seek some type of party status in the proceedings. The court granted that status, a more enhanced status of participation for the union, and but also more of an amicus type of a status to the AMA. And then we proceeded to negotiate with those parties around getting their agreement to our settlement agreement. And what happened in court this week was that Judge Simon set a briefing schedule and gave the parties about 90 days. And during that time, the city of Portland will be involved in collective bargaining negotiations with their union. And we're very hopeful and optimistic that both the city and the union will be able to reach an agreement. If that does not happen...
Well, if I could just stop you there, what gives you reasons to hope, to be optimistic that the city and the union will come to an agreement that basically means that the settlement can then be enforced?
Well, I think that people on both sides of the issue are dedicated to the collective bargaining process. I believe them to be bargaining in good faith, and we just remain hopeful and optimistic because, I guess because that's the type of people that we are, that they will come together through that process to be able to resolve their differences. But that's a process that happens outside of the United States and our negotiations. So we leave them to engage in their process. In the meantime, one piece of good news is that the United States and the City of Portland and the AMA, the Albina Ministerial Association, have reached a collaborative agreement which enshrines the AMA's participation moving forward in the conversation around the selection of the officer that will be overseeing the agreement and the advisory board and other pieces of the enforcement part of the agreement. So we've reached a collaborative agreement with the AMA and the city, and now we're waiting for the collective bargaining process to take place.
But if that doesn't work, if that collective bargaining, the ongoing collective bargaining doesn't work, then Judge Simon said yesterday that he's basically looking at a trial next summer to look at everything, to actually look at the original allegations in the DOJ report. What does that mean for the time frame, for the kinds of changes that you've been pushing for years now?
Well, there's two things. Of course, the United States is disappointed about the delay that this might mean. But we're also very pleased that the City of Portland and Chief Reese have not waited for the consent decree to become final and an order of the court. It hasn't stopped them from already implementing changes to the police department. For example, they've already instituted the crisis response unit. They have recently engaged in hiring, and this group of recruits is the most diverse that the Portland Police that we've seen in years. So the chief has already taken some really meaningful steps towards solving a lot of the issues that were identified in our investigation, and we anticipate that that will continue even while this process moves forward.
I know it seems like the investigation is done, and now you're observing the process, and there are legal processes that we're talking about right now, but from your perspective, have the changes that Chief Reese has already put in place, have they made a difference on the ground?
Well, it's hard to look at it and be able to answer that with certainty because it's still very new, but I can anecdotally tell you of some situations where we think it really has made a difference. The attention to the issue around people with mental illness and a mental health crisis by the city, the additional training, and the processes that they put in place. I can tell you that recently there was an individual who was experiencing a mental health crisis on a bridge in Portland. A woman that was with him called 911. The police officer responded in an incredibly non-threatening, appropriate, trauma-responsive manner, including turning off all sirens and lights before approaching the individual, approaching with caution, implementing crisis response training, and was able to, through both words and physicality, but in a very non-threatening way, get that person to come off of the bridge and into the patrol car and to the hospital where they were able to be stabilized. Now, I'm not saying that that particular officer wouldn't have been able to achieve that particular result prior to our investigation, but it's just an example, it's a positive story to tell about the way that the Portland Police are responding today to people with mental illness.
I want to move on to another topic that is intimately related as well with the federal law enforcement world and the relationship between Portland Police Bureau. It's the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Before we get to the issues in terms of the existing relationship right now in terms of the Federal Department of Justice and the FBI and the Portland Police Bureau, just remind us what this JTTF is, the idea behind it.
Okay, so the very first JTTF which stands for Joint Terrorism Task Force, started in New York City in 1980. And at that time, it consisted of 10 FBI agents and 10 New York police officers. And the idea behind it was that, law enforcement agencies at that time tended to be very siloed. And so you had the FBI over here, gathering intelligence, and you had the New York City Police Department has always had one of the most robust anti-terrorism units within their own department than anywhere else in the United States, and I think that's still true today. So they had intelligence, and they didn't have this sharing of information. So obviously, connecting all that intelligence together makes a more intelligent agency overall. So they brought folks together to sit in the same room, to share intelligence and to share investigations in order to identify threats to the city. By 9/11, there were 35 JTTFs throughout the United States. Post 9/11, Director Mueller, the director of the FBI, directed every FBI field office to start a joint terrorism task force. Today, there are 100 joint terrorism task forces across the United States, including one in every FBI field office, with the exception of Portland. That's in conjunction with the city that the FBI field office is in, with the exception of Portland. Portland pulled out of the JTTF, let's see, get it right, April 28, 2005. And to date, Portland is the only city to have pulled out of a JTTF.
We should point out that Portland Mayor Charlie Hales voted against participation, I think, back in 2002 when he was a commissioner. He said on our show, I've always been wary of Portland's entanglement with a federal anti-terrorism agenda. You've been critical of the level of participation you've seen from Mayor Hales and what he has wanted the Portland Police Bureau to do with the JTTF. First of all, how would you describe the level of participation you see right now? What exactly is happening with Portland police officers and the FBI?
Now, the Portland Police is very involved in collaborating with the FBI, both through the JTTF and on a variety of law enforcement issues. Basically, if there's any case, if there's any investigation that has a nexus to public safety in Portland, the first person that is going to get a call from the FBI is Chief Reese. So my impression is that the relationship is strong and the collaboration is good. The difference is, the key issue for me that is lacking is that the Portland Police are not members of the JTTF. And what that means is they have not signed the memorandum of understanding that would allow them to be fully integrated in the day-to-day intelligence sharing apparatus that is the JTTF. So for example, Oregon State Police are members of the JTTF. They have an officer assigned to the JTTF. That person sits over at FBI headquarters, has access to all of the intelligence information coming in and out on a daily basis. The reason that that is so important in Portland is because the Portland Police is the largest law enforcement agency in the state. So while the FBI field office has, less than 50 agents, the Portland Police has 800 to 900 feet on the ground.
But if there's a good relationship, you started by saying that there is a good relationship,
Yes,
working relationship
absolutely.
between the FBI and Chief Reese and the Portland Police Bureau, then what are we missing out on?
I'm going to tell you that right now. So as I just said, if you've got 800 police officers on the street and you've only got a handful of agents that are FBI, you are missing being able to connect that information that comes from thousands of contacts every day that police officers in Portland are making with citizens. And the way that terrorism cases are solved is from citizen contact. It's some police officer that observes something happening on the street and goes in and then reports it to his sergeant, who reports it to his captain, that says, I was just at the FBI this morning and this is relevant to this other piece of intelligence information. And if you don't have those synapses connected, basically you don't know what you don't know, and you miss the opportunity to put the information together in a way that can prevent a catastrophe from happening.
So where does your conversation, your ongoing conversation with the mayor stand on this right now? How far have you gotten in convincing him of what you've just been describing to us?
Well, I'm not here to try to, I wouldn't describe it as I'm trying to convince the mayor, because the truth is it's up to the city and it's up to the mayor and the chief how they want to use their resources. They've got obviously some very complicated issues right now with their budget, with their public safety budget, and they've just come through that process, and it's been a very painful one. So I don't see my role as trying to tell the city what they should do with their police department. What I think is important is to try to build that trust back with the city of Portland, because I think people need to be able to have an honest dialogue about what it is the JTTF does, what the Portland police, why it's crucial for them to be involved, and to really understand that the reason that JTTFs came to be was to break down the silo that had become the FBI intelligence apparatus, to open it up and share information in a more collaborative way with local law enforcement partners. And to me, that openness and cross-pollination is something that I think the city of Portland can get behind.
You talk about trust. We got a comment about this, about the JTTF from somebody in Southeast Portland who wrote, "I and many other Portlanders have concerns about your support for the work of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The Mohamed Mohamud case seems to be a prime example of a low-value suspect that was developed, in quotes, into a high-value target by the FBI. Why not just arrest suspects like this on lesser charges that they are assured to be convicted of, rather than push them to participate into bigger crimes that are scary for the community to envision and harder to prosecute?"
Well, I'm glad that we got this question about Mohamed, because I know that a lot of people in Portland have some concerns about that case. It's been interesting to me because when I came into this position as the United States Attorney, of course, I was thoroughly briefed on the Mohamed case and the investigation, and then was involved with the terrorism prosecutors in that case in preparing for trial and in many aspects of preparing that case for trial, and I continue to be very personally involved in that case. And what's interesting to me is that there are a lot of strong perceptions about the investigation and the evidence in that case which are completely inconsistent with the facts. We had a trial in that case. We had a jury of 12 people that heard every piece of evidence in this case. It was tried before Judge King, who's a very esteemed, well-regarded judge in the federal courthouse, and we went through multiple layers of pretrial litigation and litigation and trial. Mohamed Mohamud was represented by one of the most experienced and able defense teams in the nation, not just in the state, but Steve Wax, who's the head of the federal public defender, and Steve Sadie, who's the assistant director of that office, along with a team of additional lawyers that were helping him. It was an amazing defense, and these issues were fully vetted in the court of law, and the American public has seemed to really support this idea that we try terrorism suspects publicly in a public courtroom, and that's exactly what we did in this case. And I was hopeful that when we finally had our time, because of course when a criminal case is pending, it's not appropriate for the prosecution to comment on the evidence or the case. Now, there were many people who were critical of the government who were out commenting all over the place, but the law enforcement community and the U.S. Attorney's Office, it would be completely inappropriate for us to comment. But our hope is that once we get into court, that evidence becomes part of the public record and everybody can see it and evaluate it. But what seems to have happened is that people haven't paid attention to what happened in court. The fact that the judge and the jury and at every level of litigation, it was found that his rights were not violated. He was not entrapped. That was the defense. It was vetted more fully than, I think it could have been vetted in other cases with other defense counsel. And he was convicted by the jury who heard all the evidence. So,
and we should point out that it wasn't just Mohamed Mohamud who was convicted by a jury in a case like this, a sting based on a
technique.
A technique. You say you don't like the word sting?
No, the sting is a technique. Yeah.
Right. And over and over in every single case like this, the prosecution has won. But the larger question is, why is this the best way to go after potential terrorists? To find people who might be a threat and then to introduce them to plans and to means and to, in this case, a fabricated bomb plot. He thought he was going to be blowing people up in Pioneer Courthouse Square in November of 2010. Why is that the best way, though, to go after people?
I'll tell you why, because the other way is 9/11. I mean, you're basically
Is
asking.
it's that simple. Either
Or
either
Boston.
either there's a successful plot,
Right.
or there are fabricated plots. There's no other way to go after people.
Well, I think it seems pretty clear. Either you wait for somebody to commit a crime, or you stop them before they commit a crime. So those are sort of the options. I mean, there have been other cases.
I'm glad you brought.
There have been other cases. There have been cases where, through investigation, law enforcement has learned of somebody who's planning to do something and stop them. There was a case where, you know, they find the guy outside the stadium with the ammonia truck bomb, ready to blow up the stadium, and they stop him just before it happens. I mean, that's scary to us. I mean, so I do think in law enforcement, you would rather not have the guy sitting outside the stadium, you know, with the match in his hand. You would rather find out about it and disrupt it, but you also need the evidence to do it. And it's not, yes, they've gotten a lot of attention in terrorism cases, and that has been a technique that the FBI has used to disrupt plots, but they are used in other contexts as well. You have undercover agents go in the context of a drug trafficking organization case, infiltrate, sell drugs to people, do undercover buys. I mean, so the idea of using undercovers in a sting operation is not unique to terrorism cases, and it's something that's gone on in this country for a very long time. Now, in the case of the Mohammed case, they had developed sufficient intelligence information, which was all part of the record at trial, in terms of his direct contact with al-Qaeda operatives overseas, planning to engage in violent acts overseas. He had published articles in Jihad Recollections. He had written. He had plenty of writings and had literally, you know, published in terrorist publications about how people should engage in terrorist activities against the United States. So it was, and all of that before he had any contact with anybody from the FBI. So the concept that, you know, until he met the undercovers, he was, you know, just kind of an innocent kid going about his business, I don't think was borne out by the evidence, and it's not what the jury found.
How do you think stings like that and trials like that affect the relationship between local or federal law enforcement, and in this case, the Somali American community, or Muslim American community, or other communities in the Portland area?
Well, I'm engaged in a lot of conversations with the with many different Muslim communities in Oregon, around the state, and specifically with the Somali community in Portland. And my experience has been that they are incredibly patriotic, law-abiding folks who are just as concerned about public safety, and more significantly, they are tremendously concerned about their youth being radicalized. So I have found Muslim leaders, imams, and specifically the Somali community in Portland to be incredibly responsive to partnering with both federal and local law enforcement folks to come in and help them to engage their youth in a way that's pro-social and keeps them integrated in the fabric of our community.
As responsive now as before the Mohamed Mohamud trial?
Absolutely. In fact, I sat through large portions of the Mohamed Mohamud trial with one of the leaders of the Somali community, of the Somali American Council of Portland, during the trial. So absolutely, even during the trial. And obviously, this case of Mohammed is a tragedy. I mean, it's not, the guilty verdict in this case is not a victory for the government. It's a tragedy for the whole community of Portland, of Oregon, of the United States, for the Somali community, for the Muslim community, for, Beaverton, Oregon State, Oregonians. I mean, this is a kid that was lost. And the lesson from this has to be, how do we stop violent extremism from taking hold? And this is one of our kids. And just like the Boston bombers, I mean, we've got to be asking ourselves, how do we keep these kids from slipping through the crack and falling victim to radical extremist ideology?
We have a lot more coming up with Amanda Marshall, U.S. Attorney for the District of Oregon. Coming up, we're going to ask, among other things, how the feds are going to approach newly regulated medical marijuana dispensaries in Oregon, and soon-to-be legal recreational marijuana stores in Washington. That's in a minute when Think Out Loud continues. You're listening to Think Out Loud on OPB. I'm Dave Miller. If you're just tuning in, I'm talking with Amanda Marshall, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Oregon. We're coming to you from the Governor Hotel. It's a Friday forum for the City Club of Portland. It's also a forum, as always, on this show for Oregon and Southwest Washington. If you have questions for Amanda Marshall, our number is 1-888-665-5865. The website, opb.org/thinkoutloud. Let's take a question from our audience. Give us your name and then your question.
I'm Edward Hershey. I'm a member of the City Club and of 2 boards that provide citizen input to the Portland Police Bureau. Ms. Marshall, do you concur with Mayor Hale's assessment that the Bureau is in need of a basic and profound culture change to better serve us all? And beyond the specific steps you've described and that are in the lawsuit and the consent decree, how do you suggest the city go about that?
Well, you know, that's a pretty broad statement, but I obviously agree with it, at least in part, because if I didn't, I wouldn't have filed the lawsuit against the city. I mean, we made findings that beyond just isolated incidences of conduct, that there was a pattern and practice, that there was, I mean, to use your word, a culture that had developed within the Portland Police Bureau that needed to be addressed in a very significant way, and that's why we initiated the proceeding that led to the filing of the settlement and the consent decree. How they will go about that, I think we've spelled that out partially within the settlement agreement itself, but also one of the things that they've done that I think is absolutely key is that they have to diversify the force. And so the chief's efforts recently at bringing in this very diverse class of recruits, I think, is a huge step in the right direction, because it's only when there's more diversity throughout the police force, and not just in terms of race, but in terms of gender, sexual orientation, background, that's really going to be the sea change that we're waiting to see. And also on the management team. Chief Reese has recently made some really, I think, great moves on the management team in diversifying at even the top level. And so, there are a lot of things in the agreement that are very specific about the use of force policy and about training and about crisis response. But I think ultimately, when you talk about a culture shift, it's gonna shift when the face of the police bureau looks different.
Let's take another question from the audience.
Win Wakala, City Club member and also Executive Director for FAST, which stands for Fight Against Sex Trafficking. Thank you, Amanda, for all your work on sex trafficking. I have kind of a 2-part question. I've had the honor to meet with people from other countries on human trafficking, and they have through World Affairs Council, and they've gone to different cities, and they tell us that we are doing more here than anywhere else they went in the United States, and that makes me very proud. And another question, and I wanted to know your opinion of what you've seen of that, and another problem we do have is people still don't realize there is a problem, and part of it is because there's no statistics. You look at the national crime statistics that the FBI uses, the codes, there's still a code for homosexual sex, but there's nothing for human trafficking. What can we do about this?
Okay, well, one thing I just want to make clear, because I think, thank you, and your point is great. Human trafficking is a nebulous concept in my mind, and when I came into the office, I said, what's human trafficking? What are we talking about? And we had a task force that looked at human trafficking, and the federal statute uses that term, human trafficking, and they use it to describe both, within that statute, both adult sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, and adult and child labor trafficking are all covered. But in this task force, we had partners at the table from immigration advocacy agencies, Catholic charities, and then child welfare and the juvenile justice system, and nobody was really speaking the same language. And as somebody with a child welfare background, I came in and said, whoa, we need to separate this out, because one side of this is really looking at a juvenile justice and a child welfare problem, and the other side, we need the immigration advocates at the table. We need to be talking about how we can get people U visas and T visas visas so that they can be safe to be able to come and testify and feel secure. The outreach is completely different. From a victimology standpoint, it's completely unrelated. And so we need to separate this out in terms of the way that we address this, the way we address the cases. So we did, and once we did that, we saw both areas being a lot more responsive, so that for the first time in my office, we have foreign-born and labor trafficking cases in the office. And also, we've tripled the number of indictments that we did in the last year on child sex trafficking cases. But what's missing in Oregon, I think we do a great job in Portland. Diane McKeel has been an absolute leader on this issue. Representative Tomei has shown amazing leadership as well in the legislature and outside the legislature. I was at her house yesterday with Diane trying to figure out how do we get a long-term secure residential treatment facility for these kids, because that is the piece that is missing. That is what, and we may do a great job, but you know what, we don't do enough. And as long as kids are being raped in hotel rooms for money on 82nd, we haven't done enough. And people need to wake up to this. You talked about statistics. I'm working with a professor at Portland State University. He's completed research looking at data from DHS Child Welfare and from the Sexual Assault Resource Center. And we have, for the first time, quantified reliably the number of children who have been trafficked for sex in Portland, and it's more than 400. And they're disproportionately African American, and a high percentage of them have birthed children. So it is a significant child welfare crisis in this city, and it's time for the state to step up and take leadership on this issue.
I'd like to follow up on this, because my understanding is obviously you're charged with following federal law and prosecuting federal law, but you also have some leeway as to what you can focus on, and you've made the decision to focus the weight of federal law enforcement onto child sex trafficking in a way that hasn't really been done before in Oregon, and really in a lot of ways hasn't been done in other states. What is your argument for why this should be a federal law enforcement issue?
Well, when we look at what is a federal law enforcement issue, you know, we really look at where we can make the most impact in terms of public safety. What cases are the most significant to the community, and how can I or my office uniquely impact a law enforcement problem or a public safety problem in a way that others can't? One of the things that we've done in the realm of child sex trafficking, and it's also related to the prosecutions we do in other child exploitation, child pornography cases, is we've convened a task force of state and local prosecutors and law enforcement, along with federal prosecutors and law enforcement and investigators, to really identify which cases should go federal and which should go state. We've brought in special AUSAs from district attorneys' offices in Jackson County, Washington County, Clackamas County, Multnomah County, and the Oregon Department of Justice to sit at the table with us and try to figure out, from a victim standpoint, from a prosecution standpoint, who are the worst of the worst? Who are the people that should be taken federally? Now, JR, Yusufisa, the prosecutor at the DA's office here in Multnomah County, does fantastic work in Portland and does more cases every year than our office does, because we do select those cases very carefully that make the most sense to come across the street and go federal. But it is absolutely an interest of the United States to protect these kids from sex trafficking, and that's the reason Congress passed the federal law.
Let's move on to marijuana laws, which have changed a lot in the last year or so. Now that the Oregon legislature, to start with, Oregon has legalized and regulated medical marijuana dispensaries after they were in a kind of gray area. Both sides agreed to that. What will this mean in terms of federal oversight and federal prosecution?
Well, it won't mean much. There is no federal oversight. So the state legislature passed a statute that makes it clear that dispensaries can operate and sets forth the parameters and a scheme for regulation. So, you know, that's the state's responsibility, and our office has nothing to do with that. It won't change much in terms of how we operate. We have been operating for some time under direction from the Department of Justice to really be careful about the way we use our resources in this issue. And in 2009, a memo came out from David Ogden, then the Deputy Attorney General, that basically directed U.S. attorneys to continue to be aggressive where drug trafficking organizations were involved, drug trafficking organizations that were trafficking marijuana, to continue to be aggressive in terms of criminal enterprises. But in terms of people who had a medical condition and were using marijuana consistent with state law, basically don't use your resources there. Now, the irony about that is that, frankly, nobody ever would have. The DEA and the U.S. attorneys across the country were never going to be knocking on the door of the cancer patient with an ounce of marijuana or the grandma with glaucoma and say, slamming on the cuffs and taking them to federal court. Our prosecution guidelines are such that unless you have a truckload of marijuana, we're really not going to be at your door. And nothing has really changed about that. We have aggressively gone after drug trafficking organizations and large-scale growers of marijuana, and some people have referred to those as medical marijuana cases. The cases in Southern Oregon, I think we've had about a dozen indictments. The truth is, they're not medical marijuana. They're drug traffickers. They're people who might say, hey, don't touch my crops, I'm growing this for patients, but when we've scratched the surface, they're shipping marijuana out of state, and they're basically drug traffickers who are operating for profit, and they're not growing for patients, and that will continue.
What about full legalization, in this case in Washington and Colorado? There's no Ogden memo yet from D.C. About how AUSAs all across the country are going to be handling this. But what's your best guess as to what's going to happen? In other words, maybe the simple question is there a difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana in terms of the federal government's approach to it when states decide something like that is legal?
Well, I think there's clearly a difference in legalizing for recreational use and medicinal use. And I know here in Oregon, Oregonians have recognized that difference by striking down the initiative to legalize for recreational use while supporting the ongoing medicinal legalization. So from the federal standpoint, it definitely muddies the waters pretty significantly because it's a little more obvious to us when we walk into a drug trafficker's grow operation that, what they're actually doing. But if there's, but under the recreational scheme, it's a little more difficult because it's sort of like what is illegal? What is in violation of state law pursuant to the Ogden memo? So in terms of my best guess, it is an incredibly complicated issue. Not only legally, there's a piece about will the Department of Justice file a preemption lawsuit? What is the law here? What's the legal answer? There's a policy issue that the administration has to decide. And then there are issues that concern the State Department over our treaties with foreign nations and whether or not we'll be in violation of those treaties if we are allowing marijuana to be legal when we've said that we wouldn't. So it is incredibly complicated, and I'm not a betting USA, and I'm not going to bet you on the outcome.
How about this? Are you happy, relieved that you're not a USA in Colorado or Washington? You are.
I talked to John Walsh on the phone an hour this week, and I'm just glad I'm not him.
Can you give us a sense for what he's dealing with?
You can imagine what he's dealing with.
Well, but maybe we can't.
I don't want to speak for John, but if I were in his situation and that was in Oregon, it's very difficult because you're sort of on hold, and you want to do the right thing and continue to do your job and enforce federal law, but you're also not sure next week what that will look like. And ultimately, I think whatever U.S. attorney wants is to be fair to defendants and their citizens and make sure that they uphold their oath. And so it's just not so clear in this circumstance what that would look like.
Let's take another question from our audience. What's your name and your question?
Hi, my name is Jenna Pasalacqua. I'm a City Club member, and I'm wondering, in light of the recent shooting that occurred here in Oregon at Clackamas Town Center last December, and the shooting that followed 3 days later in Newtown, Connecticut, what is the U.S. Attorney's Office doing to address gun violence?
Thank you very much. So we held a summit at the federal courthouse in February of this year, and it was a summit to address gun violence in the community, and it was incredibly well attended. We had the Attorney General of the state of Oregon. We had several of our elected sheriffs and district attorneys from around the state. We also had Ron Saxton representing schools. The special agent in charge of the ATF was down from Seattle. I mean, it was just a phenomenal group of leaders. Also community members from several different organizations, the faith-based community, tribal law enforcement. I mean, I don't want to leave anyone out now, but mental health practitioners. So it was just a fantastic day where we all came together and talked about what are the issues, what are kind of the root causes of violence in our community. And we identified several of the problems, but we also went on to identify action items for moving forward to try to address these problems in Oregon. And I know this seems pretty broad, but we discussed everything from school resource officers, protocols for active shooter, sharing of information, breaking down silos, bullying in schools. It was a pretty broad array of topics with experts that we heard from, and a really lively discussion. But some of the action items that were identified had to do with how we can collaborate on information sharing better. And this is something that I saw firsthand when I was a child welfare lawyer. There are a lot of confidentiality laws, and they are very important laws to protect people. But sometimes they come in conflict with our ability to do the right thing to keep people safe. And sometimes it's not the laws itself that are the problem, but it's a misperception that people have about when they're able to share information, given some of the regulations that come from federal statutes like HIPAA and FERPA and other acronyms that just make me sound smart if I say them. Hopefully, but
Or make our eyes glaze over when we try to follow.
So anyway, the federal laws, and so, but to be able to get law enforcement, people that work for schools, and mental health practitioners to be able to come together in a sort of JTTF way to break down the silos and share information so they can identify and intervene with kids in a proactive way prior to a kid walking into a school or an adult walking into a shopping mall. But so that's in the school setting, but I think one of the big takeaways in terms of just generally what we can all do as people, as human beings, was break down our own silos. Because when you're looking at some of these mental health issues, and as we Monday morning quarterback Clackamas County or Newtown, we find out that there were flags. We find out that maybe our neighbor, was suffering from a mental illness, and we didn't know about it because we weren't really paying attention. So it really has to do with breaking down those silos that exist between us all, taking away the stigma about talking about mental health and families, and trying to come together more collectively as a community, which we do a great job with in Portland, but we can always do better.
We have time for one more question from the audience. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Joanne Hardesty, City Club member. And Amanda, you know I'm going back to place. Your first response to the first City Club question in how to change the culture of Portland Police was to diversify the force. If we train people of color to treat people in the community the same way that police officers currently do, we will just have people of color violating the constitutional rights of people in the community. And so I think that answer didn't go far enough. And so I want to challenge you. The culture clearly needs to be changed. And so it's not just a matter of making people different colors. Maybe you've got some other ideas?
No, of course I do, Joanne. And as you know, that is contained in the agreement, is the training. And I know you're well aware of that. So, and I think my answer was there are a lot of very detailed provisions of the consent decree, which I don't want everyone's eyes to glaze over. But by the way, it's available.
I meant that in the best way.
Yeah, it's available online, so everyone can go and read it. It's a public document. But there are some very detailed provisions that speak directly to what Joanne mentioned about training and trying to help people to have the tools they need to be able to be more successful in interfacing with the public in a pro-social and supportive way. But I think also, Joanne, you'd agree that if we had the training and didn't have the diversification, we wouldn't go far enough. Those are both important aspects.
I want to turn a little bit to your biography. I mentioned at the top that you have described yourself as a rebellious and challenging child. What did you mean by those words?
I think I'm still a rebellious and challenging child sometimes. Well, what I meant was, during my high school years, I think like a lot of kids, I was pretty rebellious and challenging. I mean, I gave my parents a run for their money. I was the, talk back, ask questions. The bumper sticker on my first car said, "Question authority." And I think I certainly lived that. I had somewhat of a chaotic upbringing with a single mom, moving a lot, had a lot of responsibility as a very young kid for taking care of myself and my sister. I don't want to give the perception that I'm complaining about those things. I think they were very character building and informed the person I am today.
How do you go from question authority on the bumper sticker to enforce authority? I mean, right, for the federal government, that is your job right now.
I think one of the really spectacular things about this point in time in history is that you have a lot of people in the administration that I have met, United States attorneys around the country, and the President of our United States, who probably were people who 20 years ago you could have found a question authority bumper sticker, somewhere in their possession. So I think that you have, I am not so unique within our current government system. It is a time when, and I think that's why you've seen so much progress on issues like civil rights, on issues like really going after police brutality, on issues like gender inequity and sexual assault and gay marriage. I think it's because you have a lot of rebels right now in positions of power that are doing the things that we always thought we would do if we were sitting where we're sitting today.
But still, what drew you to prosecution? I mean, as it doesn't seem like the exact obvious fit for the rebel you're describing, the one who's going to enforce laws.
I think what drew me to it was a feeling that I think started developing in law school. As I was studying the law, it was the optimism and the understanding that those who created our legal system, first of all, were rebels. They were fighting off oppression, and that the legal system and our justice system is designed to enshrine opportunity and equality and fair treatment. And as long as those laws are followed justly, they are the way that we fight against tyranny and oppression. And I found great peace and solace, I think partly because my background was somewhat chaotic. I felt that the law was a place where I could, if I adhered to those ideals, find that ability to trust and be safe and that if they, now I'm just like losing it.
But that's interesting. So that after a childhood in which you moved around a lot and didn't always have an authority figure, that prosecution was a place that offered clarity and a sense of order. Rules.
Yeah. I liked the idea of structure and rules that would be applied fairly and equally, and you would know what to expect if they were followed. The right outcome would occur. I thought that seemed right. And the other thing with being a prosecutor...
But has that actually been borne out? Is it like that, or because that sounds like the beautiful ideal vision of prosecution,
Absolutely.
but my guess is that it's muddier than that.
It is always muddier than that. It's so gray. It's not black and white. And thank God that we have discretion as prosecutors and that judges have discretion and that we can continue to be human beings and evaluate each person individually. So no, it's absolutely not. But one of the things that I also found in prosecution was, the ability to fight for causes that I believed in. I started off as a domestic violence prosecutor in Coos County. I went on to represent the Child Welfare Agency in Portland, protecting the rights of kids who had been abused and neglected and lived their lives in foster care. And now at the U.S. Attorney's Office, child sex trafficking, the work we do in Indian country, I feel like it's a great place to do things that I care deeply about.
What were the challenges of going, your previous prosecutorial experience and organizational experience was either at the county level or the state level, and then you were made the boss of 100+ prosecutors and staff at the federal level in your first federal job. What were the challenges there?
Well, I think in some ways my path made me more prepared for the challenges that you described in terms of coming in and to a staff of 100 people. I left a job where I supervised 50 lawyers and a staff of more than 100 people. So administratively, I didn't feel overwhelmed by coming into a position where I'm managing lawyers and staff in a legal office. And I think anybody who's been a manager of a law firm or public or private sector law office would tell you those skills are very transferable. The difference was really, the difference between the federal system and the state system in terms of court. Now, when I was working for the Oregon Department of Justice, I had the opportunity to appear in numerous counties all throughout the state of Oregon. And I'll tell you what, going from courthouse to courthouse in Oregon and judge to judge, going from Marion County to Deschutes County to Coos County to Multnomah County, it's not all the same. It's a very diverse practice that happens, and you learn to adapt and be flexible, and it really wasn't that different coming into the federal courthouse. I mean, and it's just going to another, it's fancier, it's prettier.
Do people dress better?
People do dress better, Dave.
So what do you wish you had known? We have about a minute left. What do you wish you had known when you took this job about 2 years ago?
I guess what I wish I would have known is how, I don't know that there's any way I could have known this. People told me this, but you can't really understand it until you're there, is how absolutely inspiring and amazing the lawyers in my office are, and the support staff, and the victims advocates, and the people that run the audio visual, and the IT guy. I mean, these are the most amazing people. And I think if I had known how completely dedicated every one of these people was to the success of the office, and in turn to my success as a U.S. attorney, I would have felt a lot more confident walking in the front door. But I've learned that now.
That took a turn there, which I wasn't expecting. But so you started. But is there something that would have actually made your time easier if you had known now?
It would have made me easier for me, because I think, as you point out, as an outsider to the federal system coming in, and having been a lawyer at state DOJ during a time when we at State Department of Justice went through a transition in leadership. And so having experienced as a state managing attorney what that was like, I was trepidatious about the fanfare that I would have coming into the U.S. Attorney's Office. I mean, they didn't know who I was. I thought it would be fair for them to be wary of me and hold me at arm's length, and that is absolutely not what happened. So I think had I understood that coming in, I would have come in with a much stronger sense of confidence.
Amanda Marshall, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Amanda Marshall is Oregon's U.S. attorney, the U.S. attorney for the District of Oregon. Monday on the show, we're going to check in on Oregon's housing market with a senior economist from the state. We're also going to ask what should happen with Portland's Right to Dream 2 encampment for people who are homeless. That's a question in front of a Multnomah County judge right now. Thanks very much for tuning in this week. I'm Dave Miller. Have a great weekend. All right. Get up there now. Might as well just start.
Dave Graff, City Club member. I was curious, the discussion of the Joint Terrorism Task Force comes up now and then, and correct me if I'm wrong, because my memory is not as young as it once was, but if I recall correctly, the reason Portland originally did not take part happened when Tom Potter was mayor, and he chose to not engage specifically over the principle of police officers who would be involved would have security clearance, that their supervisors and the mayor would not be party to, and that was the issue, the only issue of conflict originally, but nobody seems to talk about it. They all talk about like it's some other sad thing, but nobody goes back to that, which is actually a meaningful principle. Could you discuss that, please?
Well, I can't discuss what happened in 2005 because I wasn't in my position then, and I mean, I know about it basically from reading about it, but I wasn't personally, sitting at the table attending those meetings. But that said, I know that the chain of supervision was an issue, and it has been a part of the conversation, and it was a part of the effort by the City Council in 2010 to pass a resolution that would speak to some of those issues. I don't know that that's an issue today because the police chief, Mike Reese, has clearance and would it would be in the chain of command and involved in that. So I'm not sure that that issue would continue, because I know that the chief of police and the assistant chief of police, I mean, I think there are several people within the Portland Police Force in the chain of command who have the type of clearance that you're speaking of that would be able to oversee the participation of officers on the force.
My name is Rick York, City Club member. You alluded to this briefly, but the discretion on a part of attorneys, or attorney generals and you, and judges on a lot of crimes is limited today by mandatory minimums. I know on both the federal and the state level, this has become, at least on a state level, a very serious issue. And I wonder how you feel about that.
I'm really torn on it, to tell you the truth. You know, as a prosecutor, I mean, I'm just going to be straight with you, sometimes you like them. And it's one of the reasons that we have mandatory minimums is Congress's and the Oregon state legislature's response to a perception that there were outliers in sentencing, that there were, you know, they come to the legislature and they say, look, this guy raped a 5-year-old and he only did a month in jail. And so you have those cases. And so the minimums were an idea to sort of, you know, to impose a minimum, to say we're going to take these very specific, really horrible crimes and impose a minimum. Now, in the federal system, I think in a lot of ways it's actually been a much bigger problem than in the state system, because in the area of drug minimums. And so there have been cases in the federal system where you see people, you know, getting these really exorbitant sentences for, you know, say, trafficking in large quantities of marijuana, and people don't feel like that's fair anymore. I mean, our cultural values as a society have certainly changed. You know, Governor Kitzhaber's been a real leader in terms of looking at the shift in resources from prisons to prevention and community-based law enforcement. That's not just happening here in Oregon. It's definitely a conversation that's happening on the federal level. Our Attorney General's been very vocal about that, that they're really, really looking at his job holistically, not just in terms of enforcement, but really, as he would say, you know, the three legs of the three-legged stool. Seems like an unstable stool, but it's, you know, prevention, enforcement, and reentry. And U.S. attorneys, including myself, but all over the nation, have really been trying to engage more on the prevention and the reentry side, and not just look at enforcement. Mandatory minimums are a hard thing, and they're being looked at. I mean, I got to tell you, like, sex trafficking, I like them. Drug enforcement, I'm not so sure.
Barnes Ellis, member of the City Club. I want to ask you on the Mohammed case from the point of view of his father, because one of the things that's really extraordinary about that is it was the father that brought him to the attention of the FBI. And I think the father had every expectation that the government would head his son off from what has later happened. And I question whether other fathers or family members will ever again do what that father did. So my question to you, and this all happened before you got there, was that really a right path to take? They could have, I think, tried to enlist Mohammed to be, you know, helpful to the government. They could have done things to encourage other family members in the future to do what this father did.
Well, I got to be careful getting too into the weeds. I can't necessarily, you know, agree with the way that you've just characterized what happened in the case. But what I will say is that we are hopeful that people will engage youth and try to seek help for kids who are being radicalized. And there are an array of avenues in which to do that. And besides going to the FBI, there are a lot of options for people, you know, to come to community-based organizations, faith-based organizations. There are a lot of efforts that are pretty vibrant in Portland around the state of Oregon to try to help youth who are on the wrong track. Now, what I would say about any other father that might have an issue and not want to go to the FBI for the fear that the FBI would then turn around and connect their son with an undercover agent, and on, is that, I don't think there are a lot of kids in Oregon who are publishing articles in Jihad Recollection and communicating by email with Samir Khan. I don't think that, so there's kind of a leap between, I think my kid has some radical ideas and I'm looking for some resources, and how far down Mohamed Mohamud had gone on that road in terms of his contact with Al-Qaeda operatives and actually planning to engage in violent extremist combat. So I guess it is, I would certainly understand. I'm the mother of 3 boys. So, I am very empathetic to Mohammed's father and his mother. I think they did a phenomenal job getting their kids out of Somalia, coming to the United States, making sure they were well educated, well prepared, and, well treated, really, and had every opportunity to be successful American citizens. And so I can't say that I'm without tremendous feeling for what Mohammed's father went through and his anger toward the federal government and the FBI. But ultimately, I would hope that people continue to reach out to whomever they can reach out to try to get in and help kids that are going down that path before it's too late.
John Leeper, City Club member. Ms. Marshall, I want to commend you for an outstanding presentation and for your candor in responding to a wide array of subjects. My subject concerns sex trafficking. It seems to me that one thing that I have heard on a low-level recurring basis is that Portland is really ahead of the pack. And as such, in the enforcement of sex trafficking legislation and regulations, we have in many ways been chastised and held up as, look at what those cussed Oregonians are doing. And I just say to myself, are we ahead of the game, or is the rest of the country in many ways more law-abiding than we are? And what's your take on that?
Are you asking me, do we have a worse problem with sex trafficking?
Do we have
More?
a problem of greater significance than, shall we say, in San Antonio, Texas, or Minneapolis, Minnesota?
Right.
Or are we
Atlanta,
prosecuting more?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to quantify our problem, compare ourselves to other cities for the reasons that were mentioned in the earlier comment, which is that there's no uniform, consistent way of gathering that data so that we can look at it comparatively. So as I mentioned, I've been working with a professor at Portland State, Professor Carey, and he has been looking at this data so that we can quantify with some certainty how many kids in the Portland area, but we won't be able to take that and compare it to San Antonio because they didn't use the same type of research methodology and data that we used. Now, my hope is that once we publish this white paper and get the information out there, that others will follow, and we will be, again, because we're good at this, we'll be a first and we'll be the pioneers, and people will be able to look to us, and we'll have a better hit on it. What I can tell you anecdotally is from the perspective of those who do this work across the country, and when we meet together as U.S. attorneys, and when you look at agencies like HSI, Homeland Security, and the FBI that investigate these cases, is that yes, Portland has a very significant problem. We're a hub city like the Seattle-Tacoma area, Portland, Las Vegas, Honolulu, Oakland, Sacramento, and we see the same children trafficked from hub to hub. And they're advertised on pages like Backpage.com, and you'll see the same girl sold in Portland, Tacoma, Honolulu, Vegas. And so we know that we're within this kind of circuit where pimps move girls from city to city for the purpose of sex trafficking. So, but you know, comparatively, are we worse or better off than Sacramento? We won't know until we can get a hold of the data.
We're out of questions there, but if you'll indulge me, I have one more question online about sequestration, which I'd hoped to get. Oh, great. I've never seen that response to a question about sequestration. It came from Hayes Moss on our website, who says, how does the U.S. Attorney's Office plan to deal with the proposed reduction in spending for the judiciary and the federal public defender's budget? It's my understanding that the current plan is to outsource the cases to federally approved panel attorneys, which will increase costs exponentially to the taxpayers, but give the overall picture of reducing costs on an annual budget review.
This is really funny how they packaged it as a question for the U.S. Attorney about sequestration, and they really want me to tell you what Steve Wax is going to do. Look, the thing about sequestration is that it impacts all areas of the justice system. So my office is going to has already been hit. I've already laid off 9 support staff. We anticipate an additional 13% cut in the next fiscal year. That's going to mean an overall 20% cut since the beginning of the process, and then each subsequent year there'll be additional cuts on top of the cuts we've already taken. So we're looking at you know, furloughs, continuing a hiring freeze, no travel, no training, all of those things. The Federal Defender's Office is being hurt worse. Steve Wax has already implemented furloughs for federal defenders. They're basically closed on Fridays, other than a skeleton crew. And in the next fiscal year, it's going to get significantly worse. They're looking at either massive layoffs or furloughs in the range of 70 or 80 days over the course of a year. The courts have also been hit very hard. Parole, probation, the marshals, the clerk's office. Probation has lost all of their ability to fund inpatient treatment beds. So that's, you know, that's a pretty bad situation. Also, the marshals, probation, pretrial, clerk's office, they're all looking at hiring freezes, layoffs, or furloughs. What the net cost of this is that we just won't have a justice system that works. It won't work for defendants, it won't work for victims, it won't work for private plaintiffs, it won't work. And so, you know, it really is just time for, you know, everybody to do what they can do to try to bring attention back to this issue. It feels like folks have just kind of given up. There's some kind of inertia has set in. But, you know, if we think that justice is important, then we need to do something to turn this tide, because it's absolutely devastating.
Madam Marshal, thanks very much.
Before we officially close for the day, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to U.S. Attorney Amanda Marshall and Dave Miller of OPP's Think Out Loud. We are adjourned.